Hello, everyone. In this video, I'm going to wrap up our talk on pregnancy with describing the process of parturition, that is childbirth. As we have discussed so far, there are increasing levels of different hormones over the course of a pregnancy, and at a certain point they reach a threshold, and after that threshold this is the point of no return, and essentially the process of childbirth is going to be initiated and essentially increases with positive feedback. So what we can see here is an image that we have looked at before. This is the duration of a pregnancy. So 0 being the beginning of a uterine/ovarian cycle. Here we have ovulation of a secondary oocyte and the surrounding tissue. Fertilization would happen right about here, and implantation. Okay, so instead of estrogen and progesterone dropping back off and therefore stimulating menstruation or the shedding of the endometrial lining, instead this orange line is representing HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, and so that is going to sustain the endometrium and of course the corpus luteum for the first couple weeks to trimester of the pregnancy. Okay. And so once the placenta takes over the creation of estrogen and progesterone, HCG is then able to taper off, okay, because we don't need the corpus luteum anymore to create these estrogens and progesterones. Now, as you approach the end of a pregnancy, there are going to be spontaneous contractions of the myometrium. Essentially, these contractions are going to be stimulated by the growth of the fetus itself. As the fetus grows, the uterus wall is going to stretch farther and farther, and stretch receptors within the myometrium are going to relay information up to the brain that says, hey, you know, fetus is growing, and the brain is going to, initiate this this stimulus for more and more contractions. Okay, so these are not the contractions that are producing childbirth just yet. These are just, starting out kind of mild and then increasing in severity as you get closer and closer to birth. Early on in the pregnancy, these contractions are actually inhibited by the progesterone, so pro-gestation or the pro-pregnancy hormone. And so the presence of this pro-pregnancy hormone is going to suppress anything that is going to ultimately lead to childbirth, okay, therefore contractions. We can also see that estrogen levels are going to rise even above that of progesterone. This estrogen originates within the placenta itself. And it actually not only is going to have effects on the uterus and lactation, those types of things, but also it's going to talk to the brain. So estrogen levels, as they are slowly increasing towards the end of pregnancy, are going to stimulate the release of oxytocin, that posterior pituitary gland hormone, into the blood. And so oxytocin is going to be really important in this process. It increases muscle cells, the estrogen is going to increase the muscle cell sensitivity to oxytocin. So not only is estrogen talking with the brain, increasing oxytocin release, it's also triggering the uterus wall itself, right, the myometrium, to express more of these receptors. So it's more sensitive to oxytocin, and there's more oxytocin available. And so what we're going to see is this feedback of both estrogen and oxytocin working together to increase the contractions of the smooth muscle. Okay, so what this diagram is showing us is that estrogen is being released from the ovaries, is also being released from the placenta itself. Estrogen is going to stimulate oxytocin release from mom's posterior pituitary gland, and it's going to trigger more receptors on the uterine wall. Okay. And so together, more oxytocin and more sensitivity to oxytocin is going to actually stimulate contractions within the uterine wall. And so this is going to increase the severity and frequency of contractions as estrogen gets greater and greater. Okay. Furthermore, the oxytocin and of course the estrogen, which is stimulating the oxytocin, together they are going to bind to the placenta and trigger the placenta to release what are called prostaglandins. Now, prostaglandins are going to further stimulate muscle contractions within the myometrium. Okay. And so estrogen increases oxytocin, oxytocin increases muscle contractions, okay, directly, as well as via the production of prostaglandins. Now, this entire mechanism is actually regulated by positive feedback as opposed to negative feedback. Usually in the body, we try to keep levels of ions, levels of hormones, levels of blood pressure, blood sugar, all those types of things within a narrow range. But process of childbirth, right? You don't want to keep, things within a narrow range. You want to accelerate the process and ultimately give birth to the child. So we don't want to have a little bit of birth and then, okay, now we're going to suppress, and then a little bit of birth and then suppress again. You want to keep the ball rolling. And so this mechanism is regulated by positive feedback. Ultimately, the more contractions are going to happen in the uterus, the more stimulation there's going to be on the placenta. Also, contractions of the uterus is going to feed back all the way up to the brain, and more oxytocin is going to be released. So more oxytocin is going to bind to more receptors, stimulating the uterus to contract a lot more, and it's going to stimulate the placenta to make prostaglandins. Together, there are going to be more vigorous contractions, which feeds back up the brain, releasing more oxytocin, and so on and so forth. And so this process really is enhanced over time, as opposed to kind of finding an equilibrium with just the right amount of uterine contractions. Okay. Simultaneously, we have kind of funny, it's kind of a stress response. So as the fetus grows, the placenta is going to release CRH, so corticotropin releasing hormone. Remember that corticotropin stimulates the release of a hormone from the adrenal cortex. CRH in particular is released by the hypothalamus, but also during pregnancy from the placenta as well. And so CRH is going to essentially talk to baby's anterior pituitary gland, triggering baby to start releasing cortisol. Okay, so baby's adrenal glands are going to start releasing the stress hormone. And you can imagine that as baby gets bigger and bigger, there's less and less space to move around, and it is kind of a stressful process. The placenta is just enabling this true stress response. Okay, so the placenta produces CRH, baby releases its own cortisol. Okay, so what exactly is going to happen? Baby's stress hormone, so fetal cortisol, is going to initiate more maternal estrogen. Okay, so this is going to trigger mom to make more estrogen, which, as we know from the previous slide, is going to stimulate the release of more oxytocin, the release of more prostaglandins, and both of them together, plus estrogen, increase the intensity of those contractions. Okay. The placenta also releases relaxin. Okay, so this is a hormone that we talked about before. We know that relaxin increases as you get closer and closer to childbirth. Relaxin is going to soften those pelvic articulations. That is, the pubic symphysis is going to become a little bit more flexible. Even though it's fiber cartilage, it's supposed to be nice and rigid, but it gets a little bit more flexible and stretchy to prepare for the passage of the fetus through the vaginal canal and through that pelvic outlet. Also, relaxin is going to dilate the cervix. Again, just preparing for the birth. Okay. So once again, here is that pubic symphysis. It is going to be softened. So it essentially can flex anteriorly, as baby passes through the vaginal canal. Also, the cervix itself is going to begin to dilate, triggered by this relaxin. Okay, and so as we can see, we have increasing levels of estrogen, of oxytocin, of prostaglandins, of relaxin, of fetal cortisol. All of these different things are increasing and increasing, increasing. They're all regulated by positive feedback. And so at a certain point, the levels of these hormones are going to reach a point of no return. Okay, so that is when true labor is going to begin. Okay, so until now, there have been contractions, but it hasn't technically been labor. The onset of true labor is triggered really by prostaglandins, a particular level of prostaglandins, oxytocin, and fetal cortisol. The dilation of the cervix is going to be the first stage of true labor. Remember that the cervix is this opening between the vaginal canal and the uterus. Okay. This, again, is regulated by a positive feedback mechanism. Okay. So as we can see here, baby has turned in such a way that the head is facing towards the cervix. Okay. The cervix is going to begin to open up when the baby's head is pressing down upon it. So essentially, there are also stretch receptors within the cervix. As baby presses down upon that tissue, it's going to stretch a little bit. That triggers the stretch receptors to send a message to the brain, okay, that, hey, baby is in position, stretching the cervix. This nerve impulse is going to be then transmitted to the posterior pituitary gland, which is then going to release oxytocin. Get this out of the way for you. So the brain stimulates the pituitary gland to secrete more oxytocin. Oxytocin is released into the blood. Okay, we know that oxytocin is going to stimulate uterine contractions. So contractions are going to be pushing baby down in this direction, therefore stretching the cervix even more. Okay, more stretch on the cervix stimulates those stretch receptors to tell the brain that baby is in position, to release more oxytocin. Oxytocin is going to stimulate more uterine contractions, which is going to stretch the cervix even more, and again and again and again. So this is, again, a positive feedback mechanism, okay, which is initiated by levels of these hormones, as well as baby's head stretching the cervix. So again, this is positive feedback. Okay. Also, in this stage, the dilation stage, in fact, kind of closer to the end, baby's head pressing against the cervix can lead to the rupture of the amnion. Remember that the amnion is one of those 4 extraembryonic membranes. It surrounds the entire developing fetus, as well as wraps around the umbilical cord. It contains amniotic fluid, right? So when your water breaks, right, this is amniotic fluid. And this has been really important in, in sustaining, oh my goodness, there's so many things happening right now, sustaining the fetus and keeping it buoyant, keeping it at a nice temperature, kind of lubricating different structures, etc. Okay, so this thin membrane is going to break close to the end of the dilation stage. Okay. The second stage of parturition is what we would think of as true childbirth. This is called the expulsion stage. At this point, the cervix is completely dilated at about 10 centimeters, and baby's head is going to push it open even farther. The contractions, again, are under this positive feedback regulation, and so they are going to become more and more and more frequent, more and more forceful. Okay, ultimately trying to assist in pushing the fetus through the vaginal canal. Okay. This expulsion stage is going to continue and is considered over when the fetus has emerged from the vagina. Usually this lasts under 2 hours, but of course we've all heard stories of much longer birthing processes. And so the ultimate arrival of the newborn outside the mother's body is called delivery. And it, again, is the end of the expulsion stage. Okay. Parturition or childbirth is not yet considered to be finished. The placenta, again, which is an organ that contains both mom's tissues as well as baby's tissues, this is not a permanent part of her uterus from then on out. It is also removed from her uterus via the third and final stage of parturition. So these uterine contractions continue even after baby has been born or delivered. The uterus is going to immediately start recoiling, right? As it is kind of shrinking down, the connections that have maintained the placenta, right, within the endometrium are going to start to be severed. Okay, and ultimately, the placenta is going to be delivered in largely the same way that the now newborn was delivered. So this can be called the afterbirth. Okay. By the end of the 6th month of pregnancy, mammary glands are considered to be fully developed, and they are stimulated by this production of oxytocin as well as something called prolactin. And essentially, the mammary glands start producing this really condensed fluid called colostrum. Okay, so this here is a glass of colostrum. It is highly concentrated, and this makes a lot of sense because this really is the first breast milk that the baby is going to be consuming. A newborn only consumes, an ounce or two tops in the beginning, and so it needs to have as many nutrients in that meal as it possibly can. And so colostrum is highly nutritious and super concentrated with antibodies, etc., for the newborn. Okay. Remember that our immune systems don't really kick into gear until about month 2. And so for the first couple months, and even beyond that, the newborn's immune system really is dependent upon this passive acquisition of immunity. Okay. Colostrum also facilitates the newborn's first bowel movement. Bowel movements are not occurring within the uterus, and so the very first time that reflexive action of defecating happens is after birth, and that is stimulated by colostrum. Okay. Within the first couple days of nursing, mammary glands switch from colostrum to start producing these two here, foremilk and hindmilk. So over the course of a breastfeeding session, the foremilk is the first milk that is delivered to baby, and then the hind milk has a little bit of a different composition. Collectively, foremilk and hindmilk are a little bit fattier than colostrum was, and so this is just to provide lots and lots of energy for growth. Right? Lots of growth is happening within those first couple months and beyond. And also it contains antibodies and lysozymes. So this antibiotic enzyme that we have talked about in our salivary glands, we've talked about in our sweat glands, right, in those intestinal crypts. Right? So this is a really important enzyme in warding off microbes. Okay, and so the process of breastfeeding itself is also under positive feedback regulation. This is reflexive. Okay, so this is not purely regulated by hormones. There's also a nervous component as well. So this is a neuroendocrine process. And so milk let down, what that means is actually ejecting the milk, not just creating the milk. Okay, so the very first thing that happens is the newborn is going to suckle on the nipple. There are a series of tactile receptors that are present, and that physical stimulus of suckling is going to trigger action potentials, which of course travel along this neuron into the spinal cord, relay this message at the synapse here. The message is then taken all the way up to the hypothalamus. Okay. In the hypothalamus, oxytocin is going to be released via the posterior pituitary gland, right? So here's the stimulus, here is the response. Oxytocin is released into the blood. Okay. And of course, it's distributed throughout the entire body, but there are receptors for oxytocin specifically within those ducts of the mammary glands, okay, which is going to trigger them to contract and therefore eject milk out the nipple. So that is the end of this story on childbirth and later breastfeeding. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good day.